The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. From Part 1, A Pocket Full of Magic. The Three Languages, Building Integration. If we want to understand our true selves, we must become familiar with the inner workings of our mind. If we want to function well, we have to integrate the discordant tendencies which are inherent in our being. Isolating these tendencies and projecting them into separate figures, as illustrated by brother and sister and the two brothers, is one way fairy tales help us visualize and thus better grasp what goes on within us. Another fairy tale approach to showing the desirability of this integration is symbolized by a hero who encounters these various tendencies one at a time and builds them into his personality until all coalesce within him, as is necessary for gaining independence and humanity. The Brothers Grimm's The Three Languages is a fairy story of this type. It has a history reaching quite far back, and versions were found in many European and some Asian countries. Despite its antiquity, this timeless fairy tale reads as if it could have been written for the adolescent of today about his conflicts with his parents or about parents' inability to understand what moves their adolescent children. The story begins, "In Switzerland there once lived an old count who had only one son, but he was stupid and couldn't learn anything. So the father said, 'Listen, my son, I can't get anything into your head as hard as I try. You've got to get away from here. I'll turn you over to a famous master. He shall have a try with you.' The son studied with his master for a year. When he returned, the father was disgusted to hear that all he had learned was, 'What the dogs bark.' Sent out for another year of study with a different master, the son returned to tell that he had learned, 'What the birds speak.' Furious that his son had again wasted his time, the father threatened, 'I'll send you to a third master, but if again you learn nothing, I shall no longer be your father.' When the year was over, the son's reply to the question of what he had learned was, 'What the frogs croak.' In great rage, the father cast his son out, ordering his servants to take the son into the forest and do away with him. But the servants had pity on the son and simply left him in the forest." Many fairy tale plots begin with children being cast out, an event which occurs in two basic forms. Prepubertal children who are forced to leave on their own, brother and sister, or are deserted in a place from which they cannot find their way back, Hansel and Gretel. And pubertal or adolescent youngsters who are handed over to servants ordered to kill them, but are spared because the servants take pity and only pretend to have murdered the child. The Three Languages, Snow White. In the first form, the child's fear of desertion is given expression. In the second, his anxiety about retaliation. Being cast out can unconsciously be experienced either as the child wishing to be rid of the parent or as his belief that the parent wants to be rid of him. The child's being sent out into the world or deserted in a forest symbolizes both the parent's wish that the child become independent and the child's desire for or anxiety about independence. The young child in such tales is simply deserted, like Hansel and Gretel, for the anxiety of the prepubertal age is, if I am not a good obedient child, if I give trouble to my parents, they will no longer take good care of me, they might even desert me. The pubertal child, more confident that he might be able to take care of himself, feels less anxious about desertion and thus has more courage to stand up to his parent. In the stories where the child is handed over to a servant to be killed, he has threatened the parent's dominance of self-respect, as Snow White does, being more beautiful than the queen. In The Three Languages, the count's parental authority is put into question by the son's so obviously not learning what the father thinks he should. Because the parent does not murder his child but entrusts the evil deed to a servant, and because the servant releases the child, this suggests that on one level the conflict is not with adults in general, but only with the parents. The adults are as helpful as they dare to be, without coming directly into conflict with the authority of the parent. On another level, this indicates that despite the adolescent's anxiety about the parent holding power over his life, this is not so, because as outraged as the parent is, he does not vent his anger directly on the child, but has to use an intermediary such as the servant. Since the parent's plan is not carried out, this shows the inherent impotence of the parent's position when he tries to misuse his authority. Maybe if more of our adolescents had been brought up on fairy tales, they would unconsciously remain aware of the fact that their conflict is not with the adult world or society, but really only with their parents. Further threatening as the parent may seem at some time, it is always the child who wins out in the long run, and it is the parent who is defeated, as the ending of all these tales make amply clear. The child not only survives the parents, but surpasses them. This conviction, when built into the unconscious, permits the adolescent to feel secure despite all the developmental difficulties from which he suffers, because he feels confident about his future victory. Of course, if more adults had become exposed to the messages of fairy tales as children and profited from them, they might as adults have retained some dim recognition of how foolish any parent is who believes he knows what his child ought to be interested in studying and who feels threatened if the adolescent goes against his will in this respect. A particularly ironic twist of the three languages is that it is the father himself who sends his son away to study and selects the masters, only to be outraged by what they teach his son. This shows that the modern parent who sends his child to college and then is furious about what he learns there or about how it changes his child is by no means a new arrival on the scene of history. The child both wishes and fears that his parents will be unwilling to accept his striving for independence and will take revenge. He wishes this because it would demonstrate that the parent cannot let go, which proves the child's importance. To become a man or a woman really means to stop being a child, an idea which does not occur to the prepubertal child, but which the adolescent realizes. If a child wishes to see his parents stop having parental power over him, in his unconscious the child also feels he has destroyed the parent, since the child wants to remove parental powers or is about to do so. How natural for him to think that the parent wishes to seek retaliation. In the three languages, a son repeatedly goes against his father's will and asserts himself in doing so, and at the same time he defeats his father's parental powers through his actions. For this, he fears his father will have him destroyed. So the hero of the three languages goes off into the world. On his wanderings, he comes first to a land in deep trouble because the furious bark of wild dogs permits nobody to rest, and, worse, at certain hours a man must be handed over to the dogs to be devoured. Since the hero can understand the dog's language, the dogs talk to him, tell him why they are ferocious, and what must be done to pacify them. When this is done, they leave the country in peace, and the hero stays there a while. After some years, the hero, who has grown older, decides to travel to Rome. On his way, croaking frogs reveal his future to him, and this gives him much to think about. Arriving in Rome, he finds that the Pope has just died, and the cardinals cannot make up their minds whom to elect as the new Pope. Just as the cardinals decide that some miraculous token should designate the future pope, two snow-white doves settle on the hero's shoulders. Asked whether he would be pope, the hero does not know if he is worthy, but the doves counsel him to accept. Thus he is consecrated, as the frogs had prophesied. When the hero has to sing mass and does not know the words, the doves, which continually sit upon his shoulders, tell him all the words in his ears. This is the story of an adolescent whose needs are not understood by his father, who thinks his son is stupid. The son will not develop himself as the father thinks he should, but stubbornly insists on learning instead what he thinks is of real value. To achieve his complete self-realization, the young man first has to become acquainted with his inner being, a process no father can prescribe even if he realizes the value of it as the youth's father does not. The son of the story is youth in search of itself. The three different masters in faraway places to whom the son goes to learn about the world and himself are the up-to-now unknown aspects of the world and himself which he needs to explore, something he could not do as long as he is tied too closely to his home. Why did the hero first learn to understand the language of dogs, then that of birds, and finally of frogs? Here we encounter another aspect of the importance of the number 3. Water, earth, and air are the three elements in which our life unfolds. Man is a land animal, and so are dogs. Dogs are the animals living in closest proximity to man. They are the animals which to the child seems most like man, but they also represent instinctual freedom. Freedom to bite, to excrete in an uncontrolled way, and to indulge sexual needs without restraint, and at the same time they stand for higher values such as loyalty and friendship. Dogs can be tamed to control their aggressive biting and trained to control their excretions. So it seems natural that learning dog language comes first and easiest. It would seem that the dogs represent the ego of man, the aspect of his personality closest to the surface of the mind, since it has its functions, the regulation of man's relation to others and to the world around him. Dogs have since prehistory served somewhat this function, aiding man in fending off enemies as well as showing him new ways of relating to savage and other beasts. Birds, which can fly high into the sky, symbolize a very different freedom, that of the soul to soar, to rise seemingly free from what binds us to our earthly existence, so appropriately represented by the dogs and frogs. Birds stand in this story for the superego, with its investment in high goals and ideals, its soaring flights of fancy and imagined perfections. If birds stand for the superego and dogs for the ego, so frogs symbolize the most ancient part of man's self, the id. It might seem a remote connection to think that the frogs stand for the evolutionary process in which land animals, including man, in ancient times moved from the watery element onto dry land. But even today, we all begin our life surrounded by a watery element, which we leave only as we are born. Frogs live first in water in tadpole form, which they shed and change as they move to living in both elements. Frogs are a form of life developed earlier in the evolution of animal life than either dogs or birds, while the id is that part of the personality which exists before ego and superego. Thus, while on the deepest level frogs may symbolize our earliest existence, on a more accessible level they represent our ability to move from a lower to a higher stage of living. If we want to be fanciful, we could say that learning the language of the dogs and the birds is the precondition for gaining the most important ability to develop oneself from a lower into a higher state of existence. The frogs may symbolize both the lowest, most primitive, and the earliest state of our being and the development away from it. This can be seen as similar to the development from archaic drives seeking the most elemental satisfactions to a mature ego able to use the vast resources of our planet for its satisfactions. This story also implies that simply learning to understand all aspects of the world and our existence in it, earth, air, water, and of our inner life, id, ego, superego, does little for us. We profit from such understanding in meaningful ways only as we apply it to our dealings with the world. To know the language of dogs is not enough. We must also be able to deal with that which the dogs represent. The ferocious dogs, whose language the hero has to learn before any higher humanity becomes possible, symbolize the violent, aggressive, and destructive drives in man. If we remain alienated from these drives, then they can destroy us as the dogs devour some men. The dogs are closely linked to anal possessiveness because they watch over a great treasure, which explains their ferociousness. Once these violent pressures are understood, once one has become conversant with them as symbolized by having learned the language of the dogs, the hero can tame them, which brings immediate benefit. The treasure the dogs so savagely protected becomes available. If the unconscious is befriended and given its due, the hero brings food to the dogs, then that which was so fiercely kept hidden, the repressed, becomes accessible and, from being detrimental, turns beneficial. Learning the language of the birds follows naturally from having learned that of the dogs. The birds symbolize the higher aspirations of the superego and ego ideal. Then, after the fierceness of the id and the possessiveness of the anality have been overcome and his superego has been established, learning the language of the birds, the hero is ready to cope with the ancient and primitive amphibian. This also suggests the hero's mastering sex, which in fairy tale language is suggested by his mastering the language of the frogs. Why frogs, toads, etc. represent sex in fairy tales is discussed later in considering the Frog King. It also makes sense that the frogs, which in their own life cycle move from lower to a higher form, tell the hero of his impending transformation to a higher existence, his becoming pope. White doves, which in religious symbolism stand for the Holy Ghost, inspire and enable the hero to achieve the most exalted position on earth. He gains it because he learned to listen to the doves and do as they bid him. The hero has successfully gained personality integration, having learned to understand and master his id, the ferocious dogs, listen to his superego, the birds, without being completely in its power, and also pay attention to what valuable information the frogs, sex, have to give him. I know of no other fairy tale in which the process of an adolescent reaching his fullest self-actualization within himself and also in the world is described so concisely. Having achieved this integration, the hero is the right person for the highest office on earth.